All right. Thanks everybody for logging in. We've got a lot of people here still logging in, so we're going to give it just a couple minutes, even though it's 9 o'clock, and then we will rock and roll. In the meantime, just quick shout out and thank you to the sponsors of this webinar. We've got G4, 800 Response, Engage, all of them strategic partners of ours. Awesome companies. All right, everybody, let's get going. With me, first of all, my name is Caleb Nelson. I'm the founder of Destination Motivation. And with me is Mr. Dustin Rhoades.
How you doing?
I'm a good friend of mine. Dustin, give us a quick little blurb about your background.
All right. Hear me okay, Caleb?
Yes.
All right, perfect. 22 years in the industry. I've worked for started out Pacesetter Corporation, worked there way back in the day, kind of learned a 10-step process in business. Took a bathroom and kitchen company public, started another one from scratch, worked 9 years with an organization called Champion throughout the entire Midwest, 9 years there as a general manager, sales manager, basically kind of overlooking multiple different branches. From that point, was VP for Home Depot over the Midwest United States. I was recruited by Renewal by Anderson out of the Dallas-Fort Worth branch. Grew them from like 8 million to 20 our first year, and then upwards over 40 to 50 million over like a 3-year span. Had the pleasure of working with the Burner Group through the RBA there for a short period of time, then transferred out to basically San Diego, which started out to be a Renewal by Anderson branch that we took from number 111 to number 3 in the country based on KPIs. And then from that point, then we self-identified as Dream Style, and then basically from there, now we're cranking, should be well over between 40 to 50 million this year out of our location here as well. But so I've been familiar with the entire United States, not just the great San Diego here, which is pretty awesome.
I guess that resume is okay. That's quite the background. I'll say one thing real quick before we get going, but I've attended a few of your sales meetings, and I mean, they are next level impressive. Blown away, not just by what goes on in those sales meetings, but just the personnel that you have, the team that you've built. I mean, every single one of those team members are extraordinary. Everyone is like almost a mini leader in your organization. It's just incredible to see. I remember the first time I attended one of your meetings, I was just blown away. So we're here to talk about hiring, and you've really figured that out, so much so that you've written a book. I don't know if people can see that, probably not, but called Dumb Tax. So I want to spend a lot of time this morning just talking about, what you've invested in this book and how it can help other people tuning in, in their hiring process. Now, one thing, I read the book over the weekend, and it was just awesome. One thing I wanted to touch on is one of the first paragraphs in your book. It says, "This book is how to kill mosquitoes." What do you mean by that?
Well, I think, interesting question, right? I was figuring it out. I was actually listening, trying to come up with a meeting topic, right? And I found this little blurb that was said in like a speech, and it said, elephants don't bite, mosquitoes do. And I started thinking about it. I'm like, man, what does that really mean? So what I thought about is, too many times in business, we pay attention to the big elephants, right? The things the big items we pay attention to, but we stop paying attention to mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, those little, small, infinite things in business that end up biting you, right? Just like haven't heard of many people getting killed by or like stepped on or bit by an elephant, right? So the whole thing about it is basically mosquitoes. Mosquitoes more deadly than an elephant, but the biggest deal in that whole equation is it could be the little things. You could be killing your RPL, your closing ratio, your culture, those type of things that we really want to focus on diving down in. And the book is teaching you that, sometimes we need to look in the mirror and figure out maybe we're the reason why our cultures and basically the way we hire incorrectly. Maybe we're looking at trying to find that next big hitter. But sometimes, again, it's the infrastructure that sits below, or it's those little small things hanging out there that can eat you up a lot more than the big ones that we focus on. So again, I call it getting into the weeds. Yeah.
Love that. And you know, most companies, they have a hiring process, right? They've got a checklist. They've got questions, you know, that they ask, psychological tests, role playing, other techniques. But yet still experience high turnover, or, you know, overwork, or lackluster results, dead weight employees. How have you sort of, you know, changed that?
Well, you know, kind of thinking about it, and I could tell you that I probably made the same mistakes, and probably still do, to be honest with you, that a lot of people make. And one of the biggest things you know, in the beginning of my career, I always tried to find what I call the heavy hitters, right? If I could get one more of this type of guy, two more of this type of guy, three more of this type of guy, man, it changed my whole business, right? So I was thinking about it. So a lot of people, when they do disc profiles, they do basically Briggs Myers, whatever they look at, they got a specific thing they're looking for to kind of read the candidate out, but that only tells you one story, right? So, you know, I always think if you can take what your end user, what your basic customer is looking at, what your goal is based on hiring, what does that end result user look like, right? And then who do I need to hire to backfill, almost reverse engineer, so I can basically build that perfect design consultant that who my customers need me to be. I always talk about in our meetings, right? Who do you need to be for your customer, and who do your customers need to be for you? So when you realize there's three reasons why people fail, right? We have basically, could be capability. Maybe we're hiring somebody that might just not be capable of the position itself, right? We're trying to fill a position, or a body, or basically a slot filler. Second is training, right? What kind of training are we bringing them onto, onboarding? What's the experience look like, right? When it's showtime and they step on the field, you know, based in sports analogy, you know, what's the aha, what's the feeling, what's the enchantment that we get, right? You walk in an Apple store, you know, what's the enchantment you have, right? Same thing as when people walk into your organization, how do they feel on day one, right? What makes this a sticky culture? And then the third thing is basically focus, right? Sometimes you might be hiring the right people, but they might not have the right focus, right? There might be something happening in their life, could be going through a divorce, could be financial issues, could be basically they're stuck in their old ways, right? Realize a lot of us try to take retreads, people that have worked through other organizations, bring them into our organization, expect them to result the same exact way. You know, if I had $1 for every time I took somebody from an organization I recognize the name, came in and they failed. And one of the reasons why is that knowledge base, man. You take knowledge, right, which is kind of our makeup. You know, habits are made of three things, right? Knowledge, skill, and basically desire, or you can change it into attitude if you want desire. But on that nature, desire is who they want to become, right? That's basically part of your makeup. You have a conscious and unconscious brain. And unfortunately, your unconscious brain is way stronger than your subconscious brain is way stronger than your conscious brain. Matter of fact, that 20 minutes you wake up in the morning is about the only time you have to make instant change, right? Or that 20 minutes before you go to bed. So we really focus on it. Unfortunately, we spend a lot of time taking retreads, I call it, people that come from our industry, and trying to untrain them. The thing about the amount of time it takes to untrain somebody rather than train a fresh slate on basically your processes, your systems, the things you need to get into it, it only starts changing your paradigm. And when I can dissect what my end result user does and then bring that back in, and I start hiring based on what I need and what my business needs, and I stop hiring on what I feel someone else has that I don't, it really changes that perception. And I think the book does a lot about teaching you a lot of that great, at least beginning techniques on that.
You talk about heavy hitters, right? In the beginning of your career. I think, I mean, that's the goal of any sales organization, is to just get a bunch of heavy hitters. But you talk about how they're likely to, some are likely to disrupt your company culture, or they could contribute and uplift others. Talk about that quickly.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great topic. So obviously not everybody's the same, right? So that's one of the goals of, the interview process, is to really figure out who you're dealing with, right? And, laws have made it weird to where we can't call and basically find out from a previous employer too much of anything, right? So we've got to be better in the interview process, figuring out who we're sitting across from, and do we want to invite them in our family, right? We're inviting them into our house called our businesses. And if we invite the wrong people in our house, right? They say 3 seconds of negativity affects the central nervous system 21 hours. Means that somebody throws something negative, whether you realize it or not, it just pretty much crippled you for the entire day. So if you let weeds get in there, again, that kind of cripples. And the thing about high producers is they generally come with entitlement, right? I want this lead. I want to be here. I want to work in this area. I want the things that you deserve to do it because I'm a top producer, right? So what happens is then you see that you lose out on business. What I think one of the best things, I had basically a guy I worked with for a long time, loved him to death, but his biggest saying was consistent, fair, and defendable, right? And I've taken that, adapted it, and owned it, right? So, if it's not consistent, fair, and defendable, well, then again, that breaks your culture because they look at you as a leader. And if I can't stay consistent, fair, and defendable, that can kill me, right? As far as basically my ability to lead. Now, the other thing that happens when you get the heavy hitter in there, they're also a lot of times coming to your organization, armchair quarterbacking you. I'm sure you guys know what I mean by armchair quarterback, right? Everything you do, they've seen it, done it, and done it better than what you could do it, right? So everything you do, they're second guessing. And then because they're generally a top producer, they create their allies, the parking lot talk, basically the Denny's talk, whatever it is, where they're bringing their little alliance with them. And suddenly you got alliance built inside your sales team that literally is sitting there fighting each other. And if the ecosystem or organization's fighting each other and not working for the same common goal, you find yourself in a situation where you're constantly managing people and you forget to manage process. And as owners, businesses, we already know if we set the right system and processes, my right cost of goods, material percentages, my systems, my 7 checkpoints, all the things that we need to do to run a successful business. We know if we can follow those systems and processes, it's going to lead us to success and the profits we want, right? The purpose is, if we don't hire, realizing that people are our biggest asset, that can literally cripple our business just by the people we let come into our business.
Well, that's a good segue because you mentioned in your book when looking at what's the best characteristic of a salesperson? You mentioned attitude,
yeah.
Right?
It's a cheap win. Like attitude's a cheap win, I call it, right? Because attitude can be grouped up into it. It's not meant to be fluffy. Positive things happen to positive people, blah 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 blah. But I think attitude comes. You got to find the right person that's disciplined enough. And this is where if you really take a disc profile and you reverse engineer and figure out for your business what your non-negotiables are. And once you figure out what your non-negotiables are, you stick to it, right? So I've got this little tiny sliver that I'll actually, when I do a profile, that I'll hire. If you set outside that basically little sliver of that individual I'm looking for, I won't hire you. The reason why, every time I go against my will, I know that it comes in and it never works out. It ends up being a disaster and a failure, right? And I hate turnover because, as you know, 2 of the biggest time wasters in business is basically training and recruiting, right? That procurement cost, if that thing's through the roof, right? My training cost is through the roof. And if I have multiple bad hires, they say average, I think I put in the back of the book that the average bad hire in my business is a couple $100,000, right? Over 200 grand. So you take that, right? You get 4 bad hires in a year. You just burnt $1 million worth of your productivity time, and not to mention your dollars that could have been given to the right people. So I like them green and clean, right? I like to take people green and clean. Doesn't mean that somebody that's a one-off, a unicorn that comes from another company, I won't give them a shot if they're that right person. But it's going to really take some convincing that they don't have the curse of knowledge, that I can't change the way they're viewing. I'd rather have them green and clean, knowing I know what I'm getting when I have them, an open book, not something that they're going to be questioning or say, well, I did it this way. Why don't we think of it this way? I don't need that. Right? My system processes are dialed. I need somebody that's going to be that's going to be a raving fan, that's going to basically have the belief system where I know they're transferring my beliefs and the beliefs of the company into basically the home, so that way they're giving the customer what they need and want to.
Right. Now, a lot of people ask themselves, well, how do you tell if you have the right people on your team? And you talk about 3 categories that make up your team. It's the cooler, the closer, and the cleaner. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely stole that from Relentless, right? So
right.
takes all the credit, but I made it more relevant to our situation, right? Because I used to use the 4 stables, right? So there was like champion, stable, marginal, and challenged. I used to manage in those 4 categories. But when I read the book Relentless, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like the best thing ever. So I thought about how to relate that into the business, right? So we take good concepts and ideas, but we find ways to apply them and make it kind of sexy to be in our business. So a cooler is defined as somebody that shows up to work and does just what it takes to get the job done, right? You're really nothing else. That's really their whole focus, is just get the minimum amount of done, right? Your closer are the people that basically do what they need to do, but for a carrot. There's a contest going on, right? So for instance, you throw one of your destination motivation things up there where you have the contest and sell 10 for the month, right? That carrot and stick that they have is what's going to motivate them to excel greater than what they would normally excel, right? Because they're paying attention to the carrot and stick. It's what they're chasing. And your cleaner are the people that show up to work and do what they're supposed to do, no matter what's on the line or what the contest is, right? They just get the job done, right? That's kind of what we call our top producers. But if you can start harboring and creating your own, rather than taking something that somebody brought in bad habits on you, and you understand that process, and suddenly it's cool. So every week we do something called Cleaner Corner, right? So Cleaner Corner, one of the benefits of being on there, number one, you get put on the screen in front of all their colleagues, and they get to share their experiences on one takeaway they took from a tough appointment that they turned into a sale, or basically something of that nature that's really elevating their success on it. And what it does too is it builds their confidence, and the other team learns from it. Rather than saying, well, who's got a good story? Then you got the worst guy in the room telling his story, teaching everybody what not to do, right? This is replicating positive behavior, right? Linguistics, neurolinguistic programming, is a study of human excellence. So if I'm studying human excellence inside the room, well, why wouldn't I want to replicate that, right? So it's one of those things that we categorize the 3 people, right? Everybody knows their category too, right? Everybody strives to be a cleaner. Nobody wants to be a closer. Nobody wants to be a cooler, right? If you're a cooler, you know that basically you're 60 days from probably being out of the organization, right? You already.
And by the way, just so everybody knows, you're telling your team where they fit, right?
Yeah, I've categorized it, and they know exactly where they're falling in the equation, right? So I always say, if you don't care, I don't care. So I've got 30 plus people on my team just in San Diego. So I don't have time to babysit, right? So it's their job than me, if they're underperforming, to make sure they come to us so they can get the tools and resources they need to be successful and get back on track, right? So it's really what I call the culture is self-managing. Even to the point, like we talked about earlier, I haven't really had to even throw out an Indeed or an ad to basically bring on another rep. It's probably been almost a year and a half to 2 years before I've even had to actively recruit, because right now my team is self-receiving, which means that every time I have it or they say, hey, I got somebody I really want you to talk to that wants to be part of the team, we tell them how awesome it is, how much we love it. And can you interview them? And I'm like, dude, we don't really have a spot onto it. Well, can you just give them a shot? So they pretty much force me to interview their friends. And then I have what we call a waiting list for people to come in and work in the organization. So it's kind of cool when the environment starts taking care of itself after you build your traction.
I mean, I know the answer to this question, but why do you think that is?
Be the leader. I mean, I think it's I think the culture manages itself, right? So
it's the culture. Yeah.
Yeah. Because if not, dude, like one of the things that people I think get confused walking into it. Have you ever surveyed somebody that left your business and really listened? Not just surveyed them to check the box, but really listened to why they left, right? And if you really take note of that, right? What am I doing good? What could I be doing better? You know, basically, and then what do I need to change? What do I need to be open-minded to, right? Because at the end of it, you know, we've got to make sure that our results are the proof that we've mastered something. We can't take it that we've mastered it. I've got that. I understand it. No, it's not. It doesn't work that way. But I believe that, again, if people know the expectations coming in and they know how to stay within the guide rails of those expectations, they know how to succeed in your business. But if they show up and every time they turn around, they're being surprised with some attack or what they feel is a supposed attack, then suddenly they feel like they're pencil whipped. They feel like basically that everybody's out to get them. And it's a sales team versus everyone else, which again, never really will build your culture. So you got to figure out what's the root cause of the challenge. How do I adjust it to make an inviting, sticky culture? And then how do I basically hire the right people to fit in that culture?
Right. Well, let's take a little dive into your hiring process. You actually break down in the book like a series of questions that you ask in your hiring process and why you ask those questions. Talk a little bit about that. Maybe even share a few of the questions that you ask.
Yeah, cool. So I think one of the biggest things is behaviors, right? Because as people, we're too busy managing numbers, but realize that smart man told me if you manage behaviors, right, and activities, the numbers will create themselves, right? So we're too busy focusing people to the number, whether we stop paying attention to behaviors and activities. So when I'm sitting across from somebody, it's sitting in a chair, I'm actually looking over because one of the chairs they sit over right there, just reactive, right? There's a couple of things that I try to find out. Number one, I ask a couple like basic warm-up questions, right? Obviously, just like we do in a house. Or, let me ask you from San Diego, what are you doing? Yes. Cool. So I'll ask something that I know is going to find a baseline, right? So I pay attention to eyes and body language like crazy, right? Did you know if your thumbs are down when you're communicating with somebody, that means they're hiding, they're trying to escape because they're not comfortable, right? So it's like picking up on subtle signs, right? You can look at eye movements. In the book, I give you a little tune on how to read eye acuity, right? So that visual acuity, which means people are looking up when they answer a question, straight to the right, right on this plane here, straight to left to right is audio acuity. And then basically, then you have what we call kinesthetic and internal dialogue. Internal dialogue means they're flipping through files to basically before they answer a question. So that's a little advanced, but some of the questions I like to do to set people up, if you walk in, because people will come in scripted, right? Unfortunately, there's some really good interviewers out there, and the person you interviewed when you get into the business aren't the same person that you saw, right? I'm sure we've all ran into that. Like this guy turned out not. I thought he's gonna be a superstar. Man, he is pretty much, he's in the toilet.
Was that a mistake?
Yeah, exactly right. So one of the things that I do to set it up, I ask them I look at the resume, right? I call that the lie report, right? So I'm looking at their lie report sitting in front of me, and I ask them, what was the biggest mistake as a position you made on here that you wish you would have never taken? And why I ask that is because every rep, most people on their resume have that one blemish that either they're not that proud of or it didn't end that well, that they'll start sharing stuff with you. So I want to see about if I can get them openly talking, because if I can get them openly talking, then that's going to help me. And then once they tell me that, I'm like, well, then I'll say this, who was basically your supervisor over there? And they'll tell me who their supervisor was. And I'm like, okay, so Jonathan, right? So, let me ask you, when I call Jonathan, I ask him what your biggest strengths are, what's he going to tell me? And they're going to blab out a ton of good things, right? Now, if I turn around and ask him what your biggest weaknesses or room for improvement are, what's he going to tell me there? And then you see them pucker up a little bit in their chair because now they're in an uncomfortable conversation, right? Then I say, okay, good. So it sounds like to me, that's some of the areas you agree to work on. Now, do you agree with that? Now, let me ask you a question. What did you learn from that position that would not allow history to repeat itself again? So how did you grow from that organization, that position? And they're like, yes. Okay, cool. Now I'll give you this one, which is real fun. Okay, cool. So let me ask you, what position on your resume were you the most successful at? And they'll tell you. Okay, so out of that most successful piece of that resume, let me ask you a question. Basically, through the entire group, how many people did you work with side by side that were your counterparts? Well, we had 10. Okay, out of 10, where were you ranked out of those 10? Were you in the top? Were you the top guy, top 80%, top 50%, top 60? What were you? And then they'll tell you, right? And you say, okay, why weren't you the number one guy? And then you're going to hear if weren't the number one guy, because now they think because I asked the question before, now I'm going to call them fact check them, right? So think about behaviors, because now they think they're going to get called out. So I'm going to get the truth. So where are you at there, right? And they tell me, well, this person had favoritism. This person had this. So I might instantly be able to point out a weed immediately just from the way I ask my conversations, right? That's interesting. Why do you say that? Okay. So if you're at that 8 to 10, and basically that's what it goes. So you would consider yourself to be the best. Now, let me ask you, earlier I asked, what's your highest verifiable income? Is this the position that you had your highest verifiable income? Yes. Cool. And what did you sell here? We did this. Awesome. Take this. I'm the customer. You're the representative. Sell me that. So what I have them do is then walk me through that process like they did when they told me they were at their best. And now they're selling me on why they're the best and why I should hire them on their position. Because if I don't like what I saw in the interview, why do I want to invite them in and spend, thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars basically making a bad mistake. There's a little quick takeaway, but that's some pretty powerful stuff right in there. Just to share with you on those two questions.
Well, you talk about speaking of like sales process, you said something interesting, which is like you mirror your sales process with your interview. Is that right?
Yeah, I use a ton of NLP, neurolinguistic programming, and making sure that, again, we work on EQ a lot, not just the same cookie cutter system that, everybody's kind of renamed. It's literally, if you start paying attention to the emotional intelligence a lot and pulling out, I'm not saying we don't have commitments and process and systems. We absolutely do. But in order for you to, one of my buddies in Denver tell me is, in order to sell John Brown what John Brown buys, must first see John Brown through John Brown's eyes, right? So if I'm not looking at my future employee through their eyes, and I'm not looking through my consumer through their eyes, then there's no way I can possibly help them correctly. Because what happens is then I'm walking in selfishly, trying to help them or sell them something that they might not want or need. Then I'm pushing my agenda on them, right? I'm not telling you to lose control, but if you can understand where they're coming from before you speak, it's like, Caleb, if we were going to both have the same conversation on something, and we were going to share a conversation off of a game that we watched last night, you said, hey, you go first, right? So I'm telling you what my story is on that game. And I'm like, dude, check it out. Isn't that so awesome? Well, the problem is right now, when we're both thinking about the same thing, you're preparing for what you're getting ready to tell me. You didn't even listen to anything I said because you're trying to make your story one up on mine, right? I think as representatives, as hiring professionals, as business managers, we fall ourselves into that equation where we are trying to make something happen and we're trying to push our agenda on people until we understand what that person needs us to be, right? So think about it. Who does the client you're setting across, who do they need you to be? And who do you need them to be for your business? And really think about that, right? In any hiring process, am I doing it? Have I mastered it? Do my results prove I mastered it? And the third one is a fact check you need to look in the mirror on, and not arrogance is a weakness. Confidence, humility is a strength, right? Another great line I took from one of my buddies, right? But the whole purpose is nothing's new. It's how we take all the greatest ideas we've had from the organizations, the industry, the influences that we have and make it. Sunday I was in a meeting with JR. We had basically a couple of NFL guys there. Right? I'm not going to name names, but a couple of NFL guys, big names. So one of the cool things is they treat the NFL just like we treat business. It's the same methodical systems, right? Same processes, same coaching, same similar things. So if you think about it like a football team, a baseball team, a basketball team, whatever it is, and you're hand selecting the right players to be out there to make your team work, it's big. And some of you guys say, well, I can't hire anybody because no one's working right now. Well, that's because maybe you're not writing the right ads, you're not attracting the right people. Look in the mirror first, identify what it's like to interview with your company, identify what it's like to make sure you are putting your stuff into play, and make sure what it's like to be an employee on the first day of your business, right? And then again, I think you'll see once you start reverse engineering, tons of stuff in the book that help you navigate through. Because the book is really like a workbook. It's not designed to just be an easy read, it's a workbook.
Yeah. There's an accountability element, which obviously, is going to enable people to get from whatever they're doing to a more successful hiring process or system. Quick segue. There's some questions coming in. If anybody has some questions for Dustin, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and we'll get to those. In just a couple minutes. A couple more questions. I know this comes up a lot in conversation, but you could hire a great team, but then there's the whole element of keeping them on board to where they don't fizzle out, and a big part of that obviously is culture. So really, how do you define a healthy business culture? And because at the end of the day, like the only way companies can truly scale, and I'd say one of the biggest factors is culture. So how do you define a healthy business culture?
Yeah, it's great. I've been part of 4, buyouts, right? Organization I started, they got bought. So one of the things I think is realize your culture, if it's working correctly, is all self-managing, right? If you're doing it right, the culture manages itself. So, like instance, we call a 3-foot rule. Like anybody steps outside that culture within their 3 feet, it's their job to pull them aside and make sure again that they recheck them on a personal level, not take it and whine and complain and tell right. They manage the culture on themselves. So if they step outside of culture, it's some job to remind them, hey, what's going on, man? Because obviously what you're doing is not helping anybody. It's actually hurting people. So what's going on? How can I help? And if they can't correct it, then their job is to come grab management and then take care of it. But the biggest thing I'd say, the success of it, is when they feel like they have a voice, they have an opinion, and then they're what we call change agents inside your business. Then again, when you take the voice away from somebody, they don't feel important. When you make sure that they've got a voice and they feel like they're contributing, suddenly the culture starts exploding. And when they believe in you as a leader, they believe in your process, they believe in your systems, and then they know that if they follow the system, success happens. I think it's really there. It's infrastructure, right? It's not giving them all kinds of free stuff, not buying their affection, right? It's kind of like love language. I have 5 love languages, right?
Yep.
Sometimes you might be thinking you're speaking to somebody in the right way, but that might be the way you like to be communicated with.
The way you receive it, yeah.
Yeah, it might not be the way you did. That they needed to have happen, right? So that culture is a difficult piece because it's everything grouped into one. But again, it starts with the people you hire. Like I can hand select the people that I know I need to hire, and that's literally going to instantly be a culture piece based on the way I hire because the individual I choose, not because I'm going out and finding these great people I think are going to fit my culture. So again, it's strategic and deliberate on the approach that we've got to take.
Yeah. How many of the sales reps on your team come from the home improvement background?
Out of 32, probably 2. Like, Janet, right? So
yeah,
she's already well in the 2 millions this year, 44% close on. We're definitely a top of the market price point. And she absolutely kills it, right? She's great. I think revenue per lead year to date, it's like $7,000. Our office is well into the 5,000 revenue per lead. So, it works. It just works because the type of people you hire really dictate how your business is going to be ran.
Yeah, right. Let's get to a couple questions here. Chad asked, would you use the same exact pricing for hiring canvassers?
Process. Yeah, I think, I would say the same thing happens no matter if it's installers, if it's whatever. Installers a little bit different breed, right? So you got to realize who they're dealing with, but canvassers, absolutely. You got a certain person that fits in your culture. Like, so if you guys do little group gatherings, where you guys get together for your huddles before you get out in the field and make sure you get everybody pumped up, right? Who in there could fit that culture? Because if you bring the wrong person in based on their dynamic, say it's a D leaning eye, right? Or a heavy D, and they're sitting in there and they're like, they're too opinionated, right? So opinions are great as long as they're controlled. But again, making sure that you figure out, if you scale it out, I say the disc profile is the cheapest mistake you can make, right? Because it's $100, right? 120, 150 bucks rather than thousands of dollars that you're investing into these people, right? So if you're taking that canvas, which can be a very expensive thing, I would say, who is my top producers on my team? I would disc profile what they look like, and I would try to replicate something within that model, right? You might have to adjust it a little bit based on your people, but if you can really figure out your dynamic in there and what you need and what you want for your team, then you can start figuring out what basically your recipe is, right? Once you understand your recipe, it's easier to keep feeding the recipe and keep remaking the recipe. But again, you got to make sure the recipe is right. So, and in my opinion, that's who you're bringing in. So whether it be college kids, young, figure out who it is. The people knocking on the door, who do they need that person to be so they're comfortable?
Yeah,
that's what I would say. Yeah.
Another question from Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous. Where and how is the best place to get candidates to hire? Is it ads, hiring signs, service, temp agency? I know you mentioned, most of your candidates come from direct referrals because of the culture you built and because people know that they can go there and make a significant amount of money based on the fact that they are trained properly and, grow, learn, and develop. So what do you think on that?
Well, depending on what industry you're in, first off, I would try to network within my own team and figure out who I have inside my own team. Secondly, you can even look at it. Sometimes we might have installers that are rock stars that have a great personality, but that might be transitioning to a point where they've got all the right skills and personality. They got even the trade industry, but they might not know the sales aspect, right? So you might be thinking about that as well. I've taken a administrative person and I've made them into a salesperson before, because on my disc profile, they were right smack dab into it. And heck, they had a better personality than most of my sales team did even. I was like, wow, this is electrifying, right? So I like people that like grow. Third thing is like Indeed is where everybody goes to shuffle, right? So you got Indeed, which is not a bad thing, but you got to know who you're dealing. So if you're inundated with 100 resumes, you got to know who your candidate is not, so you're not wasting the time going through a bunch of those different resumes. The right recruiters can save you a lot of time and money. A lot of people, I don't want to pay for a recruiter. Well, think how much is your time worth, right? So if you had to scale it down to where you gave them the parameters they have to fit within to it, and you pay for performance, then that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing to happen either. I know when I was in Dallas, I used a company, and I had my go-to person in that company that I used to feed me influence, because after a while, they knew exactly what I was looking for, right? And they would already know that they wouldn't send me what I call a waste of time, right? They would always want to send me that person that would allow me to start fitting in rhythm. My job was to make sure that I was managing not the capability side of it, but I was managing the training and the focus. So sitting in front of me, my job at the end of the resume was, do they have the training and do they have the focus to be able to be successful on that? So I tell you that there's no one right place, hiring signs, different things like that, get into it, go to basically a meet and greet at like a, chamber of commerce meeting or a better, try to find people you think that might fit your need and just have conversations. I always say, if you sell where your feet are, my goal with my team is always hand out 6 business cards a day. If you can hand out 6 business cards a day, you're going to run into some interesting people that you might meet, that you might feel is perfect for your team, right? And we're 100% commission here, right? We have we don't give a salary, and 100% commission, 32 people, and they average a lead and a half a day. I mean, they're not going anywhere. I have to literally force people out. That's the nature in it.
I was working at a restaurant when I was 19, and this gentleman in a suit with slick back hair named Buddy Severs, had a Southern accent. I was waiting on his table, and he's like, "Son, how would you like to make 10 grand a month?" And I was like, "Sounds awesome." And he's like, "I'll see you Monday. We're going to interview you for a sales position." It was my first sales job.
Yeah.
But you can recruit. I mean, a lot of successful organizations, like you said, handing out 6 business cards a day. They're recruiting wherever they go. Could be restaurants, could be anywhere.
Yeah, I ran into a guy when I got in the home remodeling industry. I was a nurse, actually, crazy enough. That's what I got my degree in, as BSN. And a buddy of mine I was playing softball with, right, he had this big old stack of cash, and he drove a Lincoln Town Car. I'm like, "What do you do, dude?" I said, "How?" He goes, "We sell windows." I said, "Like on the computer?" Because it's like brand new. And he goes, "No, I'm in houses." I'm like, "You can do that?" He goes, "You want to come on an appointment with me?" I said, "Sure." Went on an appointment. He ended up happily involving him. And I was like, "Well, how much did you just make?" He's like, "Well, $2 grand." You just made $2,000 in that 4-hour time period when I got to work for 2 weeks to do that? No way. So I wanted a piece of that, right?
Yeah.
Being an athlete from the day, I don't like to lose. But the whole purpose was that kind of got me trajected in my career, because again, I just had a conversation with somebody. So you never know when you're going to run. So I always say, sell where your feet are, and basically introduce and have a conversation with everybody, because you never know when you're going to run into that next best person for your business. And you don't know what industry they're in, they might be miserable at. Realize turnover rate is crazy. And 80% of our learned experience from a kid are negative. So we take those experiences and we get stuck in a trap based on our knowledge base. Think about it. Why don't you want to walk into a dark alley? Well, because television, movies, things like that have told us a bad idea. If you walked in a dark alley and there's a pot of gold sitting in the back of it, you'd run into every dark alley known to man. So our perception, because of our knowledge base, sometimes cripples us on the way we're thinking. So always ask yourself, is what I'm thinking moving me towards my goal or away from my goal?
Yeah. So you obviously have created a very successful team. Like I started the conversation, like it's just a whole bunch of mini leaders. Obviously there's some significant amount of training and leadership training. Just very briefly, my good friend Dave Evans here mentioned, how important it is, in addition to great hiring. What's your position on training? How are How are you tying that into your overall process?
It's a great question. We offer here training 5 days a week. And it's not that we force everybody in on 5 days a week, but we have, I'll do leadership training with our leadership team, and we'll work on a specific guide, right? There's resources where you can pull up guides and you can take it on like 4 questions, might take 30 minutes. Because if you don't grow your people, they're not going to grow on their own, right? They're going to stay the same and they're going to start elevating, right? You're only as good as your last meeting. I always feel that too, right? So, training, we do a Monday, what we call all in crazy meeting, right? Tuesday is what we call a mini, it's a team boom meeting, which is on our underperformers, 25 and lower, right? They're forced to be on that phone call, literally just activities. Wednesday is a product specific training. Thursday is a different product specific training. And then Friday is another team boom call, right? So the people that are underperforming are forced on at minimum 4 days a week of training. And the reason is we're going to train you to get out of your slump, or we're going to push you out of the slump, right? Then we can put them on what we call coaching plans. We call 7, 10, 12, or different things like that before we roll them into a PIP. PIP is a scary word, right? If you're an employee and you're on a PIP, you're thinking of your way out, not your way back in. You're like, well, I'm on hot ice right now. I got to find another option. So even if you're trying to work with them, they hear that. And that constitutes a negative, right? 8-11 receptors of the brain are based on fear based on gain. So again, I got to realize what I'm doing to my employee and how that's going to relate back to my customers, my business, and my field. So how do I, again, make sure when I'm training and I do need to reprimand somebody, how do they know they're potentially in trouble, but not get them negative wrapped around basically the post where they can't move and it cripples them, right? So there's a lot of different systems in that process that it's going to take a heck of a lot longer than what we got time on this call for. But I 100% agree. Training should be early and often, right? Meetings need to be structured though, because meetings, if you're missing appointments or times on that, a meeting is super expensive. So if your content's just going over numbers, how was your day? How was your day? How was your day? Probably not even worth the meeting it sets in, right? It's got to almost be like an event when you walk into it. So they want to come back to that event every time, and they're pumped up, motivated. No, they leave supercharged. So ask yourself, what's your closing ratio? If you got a business where you're doing sales, right? What's your set rate? What's your basically production capability? What is the motivation of the team after my meeting, right? On that next time slot. That next time slot, what's the activities and behaviors? And did I replicate that? Or did it take a couple of days for the meeting to kick in, right? So you got to figure out what it is that your training's doing, and if you're willing to give up that time. So if I got 10 guys, for instance, because the math's easy, and we're at a $5,000 revenue per lead, well, that's a $50,000 meeting it cost me to have that meeting, right? So if I'm not keeping that in the back of my mind, right? And obviously 20 is, basically 100. So you walk into that, as that number gets bigger, the expense gets bigger. So you got to realize what makes your content powerful enough to where you can afford to miss that time slot in your meeting, or so you can take a meeting in that time slot. Don't burn time slots. Figure out your times that work around your business. And trust me, it'll make all the difference in the world.
Bingo. Our good friend Rick Hershaw just bought your book on Amazon.
Thank you, Rick.
This call wasn't even designed to push the book, but after reading it, if you're in the home improvement industry and you're looking to create a sales process, and not a sales process, but a hiring process that works, this is it, man. You got to get. It's called Dumb Tax. You can get on Amazon. Just type in Dumb Tax. And any last words, Dustin?
Yeah, there's a little website we did, dumbtax.org, right? And then if you bought the Audible, there's a free PDF that comes with the Audible. You just hit dumbtax.org-PDF, and that will actually take you to that workbook, right? So they give you the same workbook we give with the Audible as well. And I know we've priced some things down, I think, today, trying to help you guys out a little bit for basically for the book. So anyways, man, that's really it. Again, just make sure, don't just focus on the elephants. Basically, again, make sure you're paying attention to mosquitoes as well. Don't dive into the mosquitoes too often, but realize there's always 4 tiers in management, right? Tier 1s are things that are mission critical around the business. Tier 2 are things that you should be doing, but haven't implemented yet. Tier 3 things are things you want to do that you want to put in the business. Tier 4s are things that outsiders bring that affect you from tier 1 to tier 2 activities. If I focus in tier 1s and tier 2s, and I don't allow myself to get ate up, I can start identifying where my issues are and I can create more productivity. So that's my 2 cents.
Beautiful. That was more like 25 cents.
35.
Dustin, we appreciate you. We love you. Thank you for your time this morning. Again, everybody, thanks for logging in. This is dumbtax.org is the website. Mr. Dustin Rhoades. My name is Caleb Nelson, Destination Motivation. Everybody have a wonderful day.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. See you on the board.